briefly introducing the values in science debate. So everyone agrees that values have to come in science in various ways. The question of what questions to pursue, funding decisions, how to apply knowledge. But where there was some dispute is whether values should come into the internal stages of scientific inquiry, inferential or justification stages, and in particular non-epistemic values, the social, political, ethical values. But now amongst philosophers of science, there's a near consensus that science can't be value-free, and there's lots of arguments for this that I won't go into, but arguments from underdetermination of theory-based evidence, the indispensability of thick concepts that mix fact and value, inductive risk or epistemic risk, so balancing the risk of false positives and false negatives, or setting the threshold of evidence which you accept or reject a claim, and the values come into ontological choices and classification. So pretty much everyone, almost everyone, agrees that non-epistemic values must pervade the entire process of science. And also, kind of in the background of this, people generally agree that there's no principled way to distinguish epistemic or cognitive values from non-epistemic values. So you have some very small set of kind of narrowly epistemic values, strictly truth tracking, like accuracy or empirical adequacy, and then there's what people like Heather Douglas call cognitive values, so fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, novelty, external consistency, whatever, that aren't necessarily truth tracking, although sometimes they might promote truth. But these different kinds of cognitive values might sometimes be in tension with each other, and you have to sometimes make trade-offs. And that's then you're making a judgment about how to trade those off, and that's another way in which non-epistemic values come in. Okay, so we've got this consensus that the value-free ideal is dead and that values have to come into science. And so some people like Bennett Holman and Torsten Willholt think that the values in science debate should be now refocused around what they call the new demarcation problem. And that is, how do we distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate value influences in science? Because even if we all agree that values come in, obviously it can't be anything goes. There's kind of clear cases of unacceptable influences, and then maybe some more difficult cases, and we need a principled way to distinguish between them. Okay, so this is the outline of my talk, so I'll just say a little bit more about the new demarcation problem and possible strategies to solve it. I'll outline the case that Holman and Willholt use to suggest that current strategies aren't satisfactory, and then suggest that not only do existing demarcation strategies fail at tricky cases, but they also struggle with what should be easy cases, like systematic bias. And then I'm going to suggest that there's systematic bias in obesity science. I'll give some initial reasons to think that, and then hopefully we'll make it more convincing by considering some specific cases in the context of looking at 3 types of demarcation strategies and the ways in which they fail in the context of some specific cases. And then I'll conclude by suggesting some implications that looking at obesity science gives us for thinking about what scientists should do in terms of reflecting on values and critical engagement. And these are the main takeaways that I want to stress. Basically, I have to convince you that there is systematic bias in obesity science, so that anti-fatness, which I'll explain, is a kind of value that distorts knowledge production around obesity, and then that existing demarcation strategies can't cope, at least with this case, and maybe with similar cases of systematic bias in science. Yeah, so demarcation strategies. So so we have this problem of how to distinguish legitimate from illegitimate value influences, and what Holman and Willholt call demarcation strategies are tools that make this distinction. So ideally, we would want a set of necessary and sufficient criteria for when values are legitimate or when they aren't. And ideally, we would want our strategies to be both backward and forward-looking, so it would allow us to pinpoint what's gone wrong in particular episode of inquiry, and also give some guidance for what we should do moving forward. These are their 5 types that they outline, but let's go quickly. So I'm going to kind of collapse them into these 3 types. So democratic, which is basically any strategy that resorts some way to democratic decision making, so either values that are democratically endorsed, so this like the proposal that values should meet the needs of society, for Kitcher's ideal of well-ordered science, or the effects, so aims, values are legitimate insofar as they promote democratically endorsed aims, so these are kind of similar. And then functionalist, which is famously Heather Douglas's demarcation between direct and indirect roles, and then community-based, which is demarcating based on some features of the community, so either, for example, Booker's values illegitimate if it contravenes some conventional standards within a scientific community, or it's about the scientific community being structured in a particular way, as Longino's approach. And I'll say a bit more about each as I come to it. But here is the case that Holman and Wilhott used to suggest that all these types of strategies face difficulties in producing satisfactory solutions to the demarcation problem. So there's this lake in Oregon, I think, Upper Klamath Lake, who's home to this endangered fish population. There's also an irrigation project that facilitates agriculture in the region. After years of declining fish populations, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service released a biological opinion which looks at the scientific evidence and recommended closing these canals to maintain the water levels of the lake. Obviously that had a knock-on effect on the surrounding agriculture. So there was an outcry from farmers and local communities, and what happened is the National Research Council ended up convening a committee to review the scientific justification, hold meetings with experts and public stakeholders to make a decision, and then their final conclusion was that there was insufficient evidence of a relationship between water levels and fish population health, and so they reopened the canals. So this is a case in which there are competing interests and conflicting sets of values, where opposing camps are perhaps likely to point to the influence of values to discredit the other side. And so Holman and Wilhott suggest this is where a demarcation criterion might be especially helpful. They also note that they're not presupposing that a line was crossed by either side, or that a good demarcation criterion should bear this out. And that leads me to the but. So I think that they make a compelling case that current demarcation strategies fail to give a fully satisfying account of this example. I won't go into their arguments now. But as they acknowledge, it's not immediately clear whether the value influences involved in the decisions of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Research Council were legitimate or illegitimate. Might be a particularly complex or challenging case. There might not be a clear answer. Maybe both of them were legitimate, and it's a case of just sort of moral political disagreement and not about legitimate or illegitimate value influences. And so there's lots of possible responses that a defender of any particular demarcation strategy might take. One of these defenders could say, well, we shouldn't expect that the strategy is going to give clear answers in every single case, right? As long as it captures enough cases to be meaningfully action guiding, just because there are some gray areas, it doesn't mean that it doesn't do well at distinguishing black from white. But I think that systematic bias is a bigger problem, or maybe a more basic hurdle, that demarcation strategies need to get over. I think they should at least be able to capture cases where a field of inquiry is systematically biased to explain what's gone wrong, direct us towards solutions. So I think this, in theory, this should be a kind of black and white kind of case that a demarcation strategy should be able to correctly identify the illegitimate role of values in distorting inquiry. So, because it's biased, so it should be able to say they're illegitimate and also explain why. In what should be, I think, intuitively kind of clear cases of illegitimate value influences. And I suggest is systematic bias, because maybe it's less sensitive to particulars of some instance or study, and maybe it's simpler because there's one kind of, sort of directionally, there's one kind of value and one kind of distortion. And in Hall and Will think, okay, well, there's clearly legitimate and clearly illegitimate values, and but what we really are interested in, unlike the grey areas, that's when like a principle would be useful. But I think in these areas, which are sort of maybe I hope to show as sort of clearly biased, it also would be useful too, because firstly, it's not always obvious that there's bias. Maybe a lot of you might be skeptical at first of the idea that obesity science is systematically biased. I don't know. But I hope as we go along, I'll give you some reasons to think that it is. But I think that an important thing that a demarcation strategy could do is to be able to tell us exactly why these influences are illegitimate, and to provide a tool in which we can critique biased science. And this is maybe also the case for other sort of similar cases of systematic bias, like a racial or gender bias. But I'll talk about this now. Okay, so this is just the kind of next section. I'm just going to give some initial reasons. I'm going to explain what I mean by anti-fatness, and give some initial reasons why we might expect it to affect scientific inquiry, and then I will look at some specific cases where I think that it does in the context of why each of these approaches don't quite work. Okay, so I am saying anti-fatness, call it fat phobia, weight stigma, weight discrimination, weight bias. There's one definition of weight stigma: the social rejection and devaluation that accrues to those who do not comply with prevailing social norms of adequate body weight and shape. So I mean this, and maybe something a little bit broader as well. So basically just the cluster of negative attitudes, biases, or prejudices towards people with large bodies. There's a lot of text on this slide, and I won't read it all out, but this is just to give you an idea that weight bias or weight discrimination is extremely widespread, affects many domains of people's lives: employment, education, healthcare, interpersonal relationships, and it's extremely prevalent. It's also like globally common. So a lot of the studies that I have listed here, US-based, but Alexandra Brewis has done a lot of really interesting work on weight stigma globally, and like even in countries which sort of historically have had cultures that are more like positive about fatness. And I use this term fat. This is a term that's kind of been used or reclaimed in certain spaces. So there's like a fat studies area of scholarship, or fat activism, or fat politics. So this is just in case that sounds like jarring for me to say the word fat. But yeah, so even in countries that have historically have more sort of positive attitudes to fatness, you still find high levels of weight stigma. What's kind of a globalizing phenomenon. And here another slide with lots of text, but this is just some components of anti-fatness as an ideology, as a cluster of values, attitudes, and assumptions. So kind of like a long history of negative attitudes. So fatness is heavily moralized. It's been viewed as a moral failing. Of course, like the idea that it's within an individual's control kind of feeds into those moral attitudes. There's a large aesthetic component, and who gets seen as fat and who doesn't has aesthetic judgments play a big role in this. There's also been quite a bit of recent work on the connection between racism and anti-fatness. So Sabrina Strings has argued that anti-fatness sort of emerged in concert with the development of racial hierarchies, and so fatness became associated with blackness, became a symbol of racial inferiority. So you have all these strands which have sort of a long history and which are still kind of present in attitudes today. And then you also have the biomedical model. So sort of historically, a more kind of moralized or maybe a racialized conception was more common, but then emerging in the late 19th century and developing the 20th century, they're really heating up in the 21st, in the 2000s, was this medicalized conception of obesity, which is now kind of the dominant way in which fatness is understood in contemporary societies. And some scholars have kind of criticized the way in which fatness becomes this pathological but still morally inflected condition that has to be combated or remedied. And here are some of the common parts of the biomedical model from the claims. So the use of BMI as a measure of obesity, the identification of obesity with disease or ill health, the framing of obesity as an epidemic, and the assumption that weight loss is generally achievable or desirable. And then you also have, this kind of association of fatness with ill health, and at the same time you have what people call healthism, so this moralization of health that places responsibility on the individual for health and that sees ill health as an economic or social burden. So it's another way in which that connects, these kind of moralized attitudes get connected to claims about health. And here's some reasons why we might think that it would have this kind of cluster of widespread values and assumptions might have a kind of biasing effect. Body size highly moralized. Moralization promotes an exaggeration of the risks or consequences of the moralized behavior. So it might affect sort of the way we're balancing doing that risk calculation. There's also a relationship with disgust, so moralization is associated with disgust responses, so our aesthetic judgments. I think that's also a big feature of how we think about fatness or body size in contemporary societies, is that sort of aesthetic claims and health claims become quite mixed together. Moralized judgments are less susceptible to persuasion in the face of contradictory evidence, and there's also the phenomenon of moral coherence. So people strive for cognitive consistency by altering their factual beliefs about actions' consequences to fit their moral judgments. So that's no phenomenon. And there's not a ton of data. I mean, there's evidence that weight bias in general is extremely widespread, and then there's a few studies that look specifically at scientists. There's a lot of work on health professionals and clinicians, and there's high levels of weight bias there, but then I found this one study that went to an obesity conference and surveyed people, and they found high levels of explicit and implicit weight bias. That was in 2013, and they found an increase in explicit weight bias from a similar study done in 2001. I think this is reflective of the kind of obesity epidemic discourse that really got off the ground in the 2000s. I couldn't find a more recent one, but it would be interesting to see how it has changed over the past few years. Okay, so I'm going to go through 3 types of demarcation strategies. And so for each, I'll give a case from obesity science and explain why these strategies struggle to capture what's going on. Maybe I should mention now at this point what I mean by values. There's some kind of dispute or ambiguity in the literature about what values, what we mean by values in the values and science debate. Are we talking about what's going on in the minds of scientists? Are we talking about something that's somehow embodied in the work? And I won't spend time or argue for this, but for me, I think it's the most natural way to think about it. It's just things that would justify a choice. So in the cases that I talk about, I'm not necessarily committing to saying that the specific scientists have explicit or implicit weight bias, even though they probably do, but that these choices are most easily explained by anti-fatness playing a justificatory role. Okay, so democratic strategies, so values that democratically endorsed result of democratic deliberation or that promote democratic aims, and here's one example, Kristen Interman's aims approach. Social, ethical, and political value judgments are legitimate insofar as they promote democratically endorsed epistemological and social aims of research. So the aims must represent the interests and values of representative stakeholders, and so the value judgments that scientists have to make in the course of their work, model choice, methodology, or conceptual frameworks, they'll be legitimate when they best promote those democratically endorsed aims. Okay, here's my example. Central aim of obesity research is weight loss. So discovering and testing effective weight loss interventions, figuring out causal pathways in order to, in the future, be able to intervene and cause weight loss. This is an example. Bariatric surgery is a gold standard weight loss intervention. Gold standard in the sense that it's very effective at producing weight loss, because gold standard pre-Ozempic, I should say. But a significant proportion of patients experience negative side effects, so like physical effects, vitamin deficiency, late dumping syndrome, endocrine dysregulation, psychosocial or psychiatric effects, so increased risk of alcohol use disorder, disordered eating, anorexia nervosa, suicide, self-harm. And I think probably the suicide consequence of this emphasis on weight loss is kind of like the measure of efficacy. Individuals that do experience these long-term mental health effects report kind of feeling dismissed, feeling trapped, and not being fully informed before they underwent the procedure. Anyway, so in studies, when they make claims about the efficacy of bariatric surgery, they really mean effective at producing weight loss, kind of have this underlying assumption that weight loss is a good in itself, or that it's a particularly important component of well-being, and a lot of studies choose not to collect data on, for example, quality of life. So, okay, so of course there's choices, right, about the aims of research and about what outcomes to measure. Those will be necessarily value-laden. And I think that plausibly anti-fatness is playing a role in that choice of aim. As I suggested, anti-fatness is very widespread, and as a value or a set of values means sort of leads you to see weight loss as good as itself, right? It's highly desirable, and so anti-fatness, so fat is bad and thin is good, whatever you can do to bring that about. You could say, okay, maybe this is just about health, and I won't go into the evidence here, but I will touch on it a little bit later, but just say the assumption that weight loss is a good proxy for health benefits just isn't always borne out. Obviously, if we're going to say like the aim of improving well-being or something, of course that's value-laden. It probably is value-laden in a permissible or legitimate way. But what we see is weight loss being given a lot of importance in an implicit assessment of well-being or being assumed to be a good in itself, and that's what I think is possibly the result of anti-fatness. So the question is, can Interman's aims approach capture this? So she does address in the paper an objection that can it exclude paradigm cases of illegitimate values, and in response she says, well, the requirement is that aims must be informed by the values of the stakeholders, and the decision that scientists make about proposing aims must be justified, and that means that will be sufficient to address these paradigm cases. But I think that's probably not true. So if we think about the aims being informed by the values of stakeholders, so in the case of anti-fatness, of course, that's a very publicly, very widely held public value, and we're surrounded by these messages that push weight loss, and a lot of us internalize these messages. So the basic point is just that it's likely that weight loss as an aim of research is likely to be democratically endorsed. There's a question about who the relevant stakeholders are. So they might include clinicians and public health officials and so on, and there's pretty good evidence that they have high levels of weight bias in those populations. But clearly, at least some of the relevant stakeholders are people with large bodies. So you might think maybe the inclusion of those directly affected by obesity research would be an effective remedy to bias. And if that's the case, then intimacy demarcation strategy would be putting her finger on something, on what's been going on, right? Like the voice of these people haven't been adequately listened to. But I think that the pervasiveness of weight stigma means that there's no general guarantee that people with large bodies are immune to weight bias. So studies find really, really high numbers of people who see themselves as overweight and desire weight loss, high levels of internalized weight bias, and also pursuing weight loss is also arguably a rational response to a society that's hostile to large bodies. And so it might therefore be expected that merely including people with larger bodies in the decision-making procedures that set the aims of research wouldn't address what appears to be legitimate value influences on those aims. So just to sum this up, so the prevalence of anti-fat biases and the ways in which they get so mixed up and connected to claims about health means that you probably would expect these biases to be part of the set of democratically endorsed values or arise in the end result of democratic deliberative processes. I think this likely also applies to strategies like Kitcher's well-ordered science, with have procedures for tutoring and refining preferences and considering all possible perspectives. So this would require, I suppose, including the perspective of those critical dominant narratives of obesity, so people from fat studies or critical weight studies. But given how marginal these perspectives are, I don't think it can be said with certainty that they would win out in a deliberative process. So the broader point is just, I think it just kind of fails to capture what's illegitimate about the bias in this case. Okay, so functionalist strategies, distinguishing based on the role of values or how they're used. So Heather Douglas, distinction between direct and indirect roles. Direct role when values act as reasons in themselves to accept or reject a claim, and indirect when they determine the threshold of evidence needed to accept or reject a claim. So indirect first. And indirect roles can also be construed more broadly, like model choice, how to extrapolate from data, and how to define and characterize phenomena. In broad terms, I think an indirect role can be characterized as the influence of values in situations where, after you've considered the epistemic reasons, you're left with some residual uncertainty, and then you're allowed to use non-epistemic values to make the decision. Okay. So, as Holman and Wilhott say, and I agree, that this is arguably necessary, so we can say values playing a direct role would be illegitimate. I found it difficult to find any clear examples of values playing a direct role in obesity science where anti-fat bias is stated or appears to be directly a reason to accept or reject a claim. But in any case, if I found one, I think we could all agree that this would be illegitimate. But the important question is this a sufficient criterion? So can values playing indirect roles nevertheless be illegitimate? I think that's the case, and I'll outline one example. And my choice here is practices of classification. So it's been noted by many people that values inevitably enter into practices of classification, that the complexity and messiness of the world precludes existence of only one epistemically significant system of classification, and so non-epistemic values must enter into the choice of what classification scheme to use. And so functional strategies would suggest that the use of values in choosing this is legitimate, so playing an indirect role. And then, maybe then we have the question about what values should be used then in making those choices, and either we could resort to democratic strategy or just leave it in the realm of morality or politics. But in the case that I will talk about, I'll suggest that that's an example of values that underlie, anti-fat values underlying commitment to obesity is dysfunctional or diseased, and it's a troubling, illegitimate bias that functional strategy can't pick this out on the basis of role alone. Okay, so this is my example. So research into a metabolic signature of obesity. So trying to identify differences between obese and normal weight individuals defined by body mass index, BMI, trying to provide this characterization of obese and normal weight metabolism. And this is what they're trying to find. They're trying to find some metabolic function. So two categories, good metabolic function and normal weight BMI, bad metabolic function and obese BMI. So that was the hope, but this is what they actually find. So while there are some correlations between metabolic states and body size, there's also significant heterogeneity. So in a large percentage of people that are obese by BMI, they have good metabolic function. You have a significant percentage of people who are normal weight who have metabolic dysfunction. It's just a lot more messy. So you have a choice about how to respond to this heterogeneity, what to do with your classification when it doesn't fit the data. So there are many possible options. So you could reject body size as part of your classification scheme, right? So you could think, okay, we're just going to look at metabolic function directly. Maybe we're going to classify it on a spectrum. Maybe we're going to classify it based on clusters of metabolic markers, types of metabolic states. Or another option is to maintain body size as an organizing principle. And this, I think, involves maintaining a commitment to obesity as pathological. So, and this is what they actually did. So these are the categories that they use. So this is, basically just splitting normal weight individuals into healthy and metabolically obese individuals into metabolically healthy and unhealthy. Also, just maybe whether it's obese is polysemic here. So you see that here it can refer to both body size and dysfunction in the same classification, which is indication of some value commitments there. But basically, classification that retains this differentiation between obese and lean bodies and might reflect or reinforce or be indicative of these wider social commitments to obesity as diseased or unhealthy, dysfunctional, which is has this meshed in with these moralizing and stigmatizing attitudes. But of course, it's still an indirect role because there's many possible systems of classification, and there aren't. The evidence is not going to give you direct grounds to say that classification is better or worse than another. However, it does enable certain practices that are epistemically distorting. So by using this classification, it enables you to see certain categories as, for example, as an anomaly that can be separated out from analysis. So this is just an example from a paper that suggests that if metabolically healthy individuals are analyzed in the same cohort, and if metabolically obese normal weight individuals are also analyzed, then it's going to have problems with data interpretation. So these authors suggest separating them out, analyzing them separately. But of course, so the exclusion of these individuals, in, for example, a trial that looks at health outcomes of obese and lean individuals, would just by design, right, increase the likelihood of associating fatness with negative health outcomes or metabolic dysfunction. So this direct versus indirect distinction doesn't sufficiently distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate, because illegitimate value influences can also play indirect roles, and probably most frequently play indirect roles, even in cases of systematic bias, like obesity science, and probably also, I think, cases of race science or industry bias in science, like pharmaceutical companies more likely to find positive results of their drug. It's usually in an indirect role. It's not kind of directly forcing the result as making certain arguable methodological choices. Okay, so my third broad category of strategy looks at the level of the scientific community, so either conventions held within a research community or structural features of the community itself. So Torsten Willholt, he examines cases of preference bias in biomedicine, where it's just talking about kind of industry bias, where the researcher's preferred outcome can influence the choices made, and so industry-funded drug trials are more likely to get positive results. And he looks at these, and he kind of struggles to identify what the bias is, right? Because it can't. We kind of know it's a bias. It's not good, but then trying to explain it in terms of epistemic error you come unstuck, because you have these difficulties from disentangling epistemic from non-epistemic values, from deciding on a set of values and weighting those values. So you can't really say that they're making like epistemic errors. There was kind of value-laden. And so to try to capture the ways in which this is actually biased, he suggests that it's about conventional methodological standards, and that these standards adopt a specific social epistemological significance. Upholding those standards is crucial to maintaining epistemic trust. So you can think about an epistemic failure as when there's a deviation from those standards. As his approach, and then Longino's approach, which is about certain features of an epistemic community to ensure the production of objective knowledge. And I'll come to that in a second, but I'll go to Willholt's first. So, of course, entire research communities might suffer from distorting value influences, and thereby distortions in their conventional standards. And so an approach that ties legitimacy to convention just can't pick out those systematic distortions as illegitimate. I have a small example. So an example is choice of factors to consider, causal pathways. So, for example, in research that characterizes differences between lean and obese individuals, that tries to establish causal effects of obesity, there's research that aims to characterize the obese microbiome or obese epigenome, comparing it to lean individuals. So all this research that, for example, is trying to either find like the causal role of body size in producing certain health outcomes or physiological effects, or causal factors that affect body size. And it's really common for these studies to acknowledge or take into account lots and lots of factors, diet, genetics, various demographic factors. But one that they entirely neglect, I think, is weight stigma. So why is that an issue? Well, there's evidence I think there's some basis to think this is a mistake. So we do have evidence that of the physiological effects of weight stigma. There's some examples, there's quite a lot on this. We've also got evidence that other systemic inequities have physiological effects, like on the epigenome and on the microbiome. And we have a lot of evidence for kind of the pervasiveness of weight bias, stuff like that. So putting all this together, I think we might expect that weight stigma is going to impact on various aspects of health in some way. And so it could be, for example, a potentially confounding factor. So if you're trying to work out a causal relationship between body size and given health outcomes, it could be an unacknowledged causal pathway that drives differences in the microbiome or the epigenome. And it would also, for example, a lot of microbiome research on the obesogenic microbiome is based on mouse models. Of course, it's going to affect inferences from mouse models too, because luckily mice don't have to deal with weight stigma. Interestingly, there's some growing attention to weight stigma from public health people, and there's kind of growing attention to the way in which weight stigma might have an effect on health, but typically the causal pathway they're thinking of is kind of weight stigma leads to putting on weight. So there is this relationship. So weight stigma goes to body size, goes to health, but still there's kind of less acknowledgement of the ways in which weight stigma just might directly affect health. Okay, so what does this mean? So I think this is another example of the biasing effect of anti-fatness because you're neglecting this possibly confounding causal pathway. And that would be a predictable consequence if the ways of anti-fatness, of weight bias, and the ways in which the experiences of people with larger bodies have been marginalized or invisible. But the conventional standards of obesity research don't require researchers to measure weight stigma as part of their methodology or to take it into account in drawing their inferences, so it wouldn't count as illegitimate on Will Holt's account. And of course, you can't expect researchers to control for or account for every causal influence. So it's not straightforwardly justifiable or unjustifiable based on the evidence. So there might be probably many other factors that aren't regularly measured, like air quality or medication history. And the choice, I find it plausible the choice not to measure those factors is not the result of illegitimate value influences, but the neglected weight stigma plausibly is, but a conventionalist account can't explain the difference. And finally, homogeneous requirements for the characteristics of scientific communities, the venues for criticism, appropriate norms of uptake of criticism, shared standards of discourse, and tempered equality of intellectual authority. So I suggested that these systematic biases shape public and scientific assumptions about obesity. And so if it is a deeply embedded commitment in obesity science and challenging those assumptions, you would think would meet with fierce resistance and might contravene the norms of responsiveness to critical intervention. So let's look and see what happens when scientists dissent from key assumptions about obesity. So kind of background, I think as I said, so it was really the late 90s and the early 2000s, we saw this emerging framing of obesity as an epidemic, which is now fully part of mainstream discourses. The Gilman quotes tend to illustrate that that framing isn't neutral. So some people call it a moral panic. Gilman says defines as diseases we openly fear, those infected persons we openly disdain, as a central danger to fundamental aspects of life or all societies. And then leaves the choice to kind of see it as a crisis. That's value-laden. Another example of work that was kind of emerging at the time by Ali Mokdad, who was at the CDC. So they published a paper which estimated the proportions of causes of death in the US and kind of sounded the alarm, saying that if this trend isn't reversed, poor diet, physical inactivity will likely take tobacco as the preventable cause of mortality. Just an aside that to assess, they say poor diet, physical inactivity, they've said that, but they assess the impact by just computing annual deaths due to overweight. So I won't say more about that, but that should tell you about the standard of what was going on. So, so Catherine Flagel was also in another team at the CDC, and she put together a team of scientists and statisticians, and she wanted to produce more accurate estimates of the number of deaths associated with overweight and obesity because there are many problems with older studies, unrepresentative data sets, inaccurate data coding, failure to adjust for confounding factors. So their study used more recent and nationally representative data, improved statistical methods. So that all looks great, but the problem came with what the study found. So the study found that overweight people defined by BMI was associated with statistically significantly fewer deaths than normal weight. BMI, which maybe makes you think, what makes normal weight? And also the estimate of excess deaths that were associated with obesity was much lower than previous studies. This kind of curve is actually quite dangerous to be underweight, and then you have to get up into the high end of like class 1 into class 2 obesity before you start seeing deaths that match the underweight. So this seems to be good news, right? So it went against the previous emerging work that just started to sound this alarm about this dangerous epidemic. Okay, maybe it's not quite so dangerous. So how did people respond? Were they normal about it? No, they were not. So, so there were professors that were going to the press and disparaging the study as soon as it came out. Critical flyers were handed out. So this is from, she wrote an article years later, an account. There were speeches, like some other symposium was going on, and some guy just got up and started talking about how bad her study was. There were whole symposia or conferences dedicated to criticizing her study. There were a bunch of false or misleading claims that were circulated in Wikipedia entries, even in journal articles, that the study had been recanted or retracted or widely discredited. None of that was true. It won the CDC's highest science award. Anyway, and it didn't affect the kind of trajectory of this panic about the epidemic of obesity. So this seems to fit with Longino's account, right? So definitely falls short of appropriate responsiveness to criticism, probably also tempered the quality of intellectual authority because people were kind of trying to denigrate Flegel when clearly she was a senior CDC scientist, she had the expertise, and they used these standard or approved methodologies. So I think there's a point in Longino's favor that it's helpful in identifying systematic bias at the community level. But the downside, of course, is that it can only provide guidance at the community level, not individual episodes of inquiry. So, for example, we might want to be able to explain the contrast between Flegel's study and that Mockdad study, to use that older and less complete data to draw strong inferences about a rapid increase in obesity. Okay, so try to be quick in this last bit. So so I've suggested that anti-fatness shapes these assumptions and choices, has this systematically biasing effect, and that these strategies, existing kinds of strategies, fail to capture what's illegitimate about these value influences. So obviously one way you could go is just to say, well, that it's really just my instinct here that this problematic is really just about the values being bad, because I think that anti-fatness is bad as a value, it's a bias, it's a prejudice. It's not about its influence in science per se. It's just about, I have like a moral disagreement with the value, so maybe that's true, but I think to leave it at that would be to fail to capture the ways in which anti-fatness produces these kinds of predictable epistemic distortions, the ways in which it seems to hinder the expression of epistemic or cognitive values. Like, of course, Elizabeth Anderson, in her analysis of divorce research, suggests that there are some moral and social values that are asymmetric epistemic value, and I think I don't know what sort of a fat politics value would do, but I could say at least that anti-fatness seems to have a kind of negative effect on the expression of epistemic values, that anti-fatness is leading to worse science, and there should be a way to capture that. But I have my own preferred solution, but I won't talk about it. I'll just briefly talk about quickly a couple of strategic considerations that come out of the obesity science case. So firstly, it's really common in the literature to suggest that because science is value-laden, scientists need to be really reflective and be explicit about their value judgments. They need to be really aware of their values. And Doug is well known for advocating for the need for scientists to weigh the social and ethical consequences of uncertainty, and many people advocate for sustained engagement of citizens and policymakers. Of course, there are advantages to this, but it's typically presented like there are no downsides or dangers, and I think there actually are dangers. So there's just some quotes. So I just searched on Google Scholar epigenetics obesity as a representative subfield, and these are just like the first 6 papers, the first lines from the first 6 papers that came up. So it's just really common for obesity scientists to be aware of at least the apparent social consequences of their work, right? So they think the epidemic is a big problem, it's an important issue, and that's, that's why we really need to tackle it, right? So they're kind of, in some ways, they're being quite explicit about their value judgments. At least they're being explicit in their sort of consideration of the social consequences, or they're super aware of the social consequences. Also, the justification by some public health people for their wild response to the Flegel study was that that study was dangerous to the public, right? It might give people the impression that it's okay to be overweight, that's very dangerous. So putting aside the kind of ways in which they voice those criticisms and cross the acceptable boundaries of professionalism or human interaction, the pushback in itself seems to fit with Douglas's recommendations for what scientists should do in the face of uncertainty. Because the Flegel study used a high-quality methodology, but it was only a single study, right? And it went against, it contradicted previous findings, so there's at least some uncertainty about how to incorporate those results into current understanding. So the scientists that were super critical, they were motivated, I think, by their weighing of the consequences, and their weighing likely cohered with widely held public values. But nevertheless, the consequence of this attention serves to entrench the existing biases in obesity science. And I say this just to highlight that encouraging explicit value reflection can also have risks or dangers. It's not always a good thing, but I don't really have a recommendation or an answer to what this means for scientists. And then finally, critical engagement. So I also think that looking at the obesity science case kind of suggests to me the strategic principle that the criticism of these biases will be most effective when it's restricted to epistemic grounds. So there's some recent work that defends a kind of reconversion of the value-free ideals, so suggesting that scientists should act as if value freedom is possible, or they should pursue value freedom even if it's not achievable. I don't know if those approaches will really work, but what I'm suggesting is even more narrow. It's just about the terrain of debate. There's a notable backlash to the moral and political claims of fat activism, for example, often on grounds that these claims are not science denial, and notably work within fat studies or critical obesity studies has had quite limited engagement or uptake from those working in obesity science. But I think Catherine Flegel's work is again illuminating as a contrast, because her perspective appears to be informed by very different values than the majority of obesity researchers, based on her tours, the circles she runs in, etc. But her published critiques are on methodological grounds, and her work is highly cited, and she remains influential, if a lone dissenting voice. And I think, Holman and Wilhart in their Fish case say that we have situations where opposing camps say that values are illegitimate to discredit the other side, but I think strategically it's more effective to point out ways in which epistemic values are affected, or epistemic criticisms, than it is to just say, well, no, look, they're legitimate because they're democratically endorsed, or something like that. Okay, so just to sum up, yes, I've suggested there's systematic bias in obesity science, and that existing demarcation strategies fail to capture it, that democratic strategies fail to correctly identify these illegitimate value influences in the face of widely held public anti-fat bias, that functionalist strategies fail because illegitimate value influences can nevertheless play an indirect role, and that strategies that rely on community standards also struggle in cases where there's systematic bias within the epistemic community. Although ways in which criticism is responded to might be a useful indicator, but we would like something that allows us to look at individual episodes of inquiry, and then I suggested some strategic implications, and that is it.